There's a lot of questions around the ERA. There has been a century of propaganda against it. So one of the things we always hear is about this deadline. Can you kind of break that down for us?
Yeah, I mean, the ERA does have a deadline. The question is it constitutional? Is it valid? Or is it void because it's unconstitutional? The reason we've always believed that the deadline is invalid is because under Article 5, which describes how the amendatory process works, it's very clear that the power to amend the Constitution should be equally divided between the national government, federal government, and the states. Well, in order to make sure that balance stays 50-50, you can't give Congress the power to put deadlines on how long the states need to ratify or to make a decision. Once Congress started putting deadlines in, it basically took away the states' rights to make a decision of any real value, because if they impose a short deadline, the states don't really have a lot of time to ratify. And if they impose a long deadline on something Congress likes, then of course it could be ratified 200 years later, which is exactly what happened with the 27th Amendment. It had no deadline at all. The Constitution should not be subject to frivolity in deciding when it gets amended and how. It should be consistent, it should be the same, and yet we now have a constitutional system that amended the Constitution and adopted the 27th Amendment in 1992, which was 203 years after it was passed by Congress, and yet we've got people saying the ERA is invalid because it didn't ratify within 7 years. You can't have a constitution that gives 200 years to one amendment and only 7 to another. But right now that's what we have.
What was the amendment that took 200 years? What was that even about?
It had to do with the timing of congressional pay raises.
So you're telling me they got 200 years to give themselves pay raises, and they wanted to give us 7 years for equal rights? Am I reading that right?
That's about right. Can you have that kind of disparity among the amendments so that some get a lot of time and some don't? Which I think the answer is no. Constitutionally speaking, that's just offensive to the nature.
Does it say anything about you can make timelines in Article 5?
No. Article 5, which tells us how the Constitution gets amended, says nothing about deadlines. It says Congress shall propose an amendment and the states shall ratify. That's it. Nothing about deadlines. There was a case in 1921 that the Supreme Court sort of talked about whether Congress can set deadlines, but it wasn't. It was called dicta. In other words, it wasn't a holding in the case. So there's really no place in the law that says Congress can set deadlines. And that was one of our points when we filed a lawsuit on behalf of Equal Means Equal. We said that the deadline didn't expire because there's no deadline, because the deadline is invalid. And here are multiple reasons why it's invalid. Among other things, and I think one of our most important arguments was, if Congress gets to set the deadline on how long it takes the states to ratify an amendment, then the states really don't have any power at all. They certainly don't have equal power with Congress, and they're supposed to. Under Article 5, their powers are supposed to be equal. But if you say Congress can set a deadline, then basically you've given all the power to Congress, because they can set a long deadline on something they like and a short deadline on something they don't. That's not constitutional.